All right, we are on our third message on Peter as we get ready to go into the book of Peter. But I have to say, I was looking at what's left in the Gospels about Peter, and we might have upwards of 6 more messages of Peter the disciple, and then we're going to go into Acts. So I don't want to just go through Peter historically and just say that, I want to try to, I guess, for lack of a better term, humanize them. Make them real. I know growing up as a kid, I sometimes put all the people in the Bible, good, bad, or indifferent, kind of like you couldn't talk about them, you couldn't make them real because they're in the Bible. You got to be careful. And so I really have grown and learned that we want to see their humanity, want to see what they were like, because they were just real people like you and I, and we can learn from them. So last week, so this is part 2 of Peter the Disciple, WC, with Christ. And we're talked last week, I'm only going to go over 2 of the books. We talked about the peripheral gospel details, and as I go through the message, I'll try to remind why I feel this is important to recognize as we go through the message. The first one is that Matthew, we talked about how he was about the 7th or 8th disciple called, and his gospel focus is on the fulfillment of the messianic prophecies. What does that have to do with Peter? Nothing really, and that is my point as we go along, okay? But Mark, on the other hand, is another one of the 3 synoptic gospels. Mark was not a disciple, but he is Peter's son, most likely in the faith. Maybe that Peter kind of mentored him and was like a spiritual father to Mark. And so that means that Mark's account of his gospel can almost be looked at as Peter's gospel, because Mark has just most likely got his information direct from Peter, so therefore the gospel of Mark is very much probably a little bit from Peter's viewpoint, okay? And so I want to read the passage today, and we're going to be in Mark, and we're going to look at Mark 8, verses 27 through 33. We're also going to jump back into Matthew later, towards the end of the message. And there's a reason why I picked on Mark's passage of this encounter, and we'll talk about that as we get into the sermon. But let's go ahead and read the primary passage. It's Mark chapter 8, starting in verse 27. And I've already used some of this from Matthew's viewpoint, so it should be fairly recent for you. It says, "Now Jesus and his disciples went to the towns of Caesarea Philippi, and on the road he asked his disciples, saying to them, 'Who do men say that I am?' So they answered, 'John the Baptist, but some say Elijah, and others one of the prophets.' He said to them, 'But who do you say that I am?' Peter answered and said to him, 'You are the Christ.' Then he strictly warned them that they should tell no one about him, and he began to teach them that the Son of Man must suffer many things and be rejected by the elders and chief priests and scribes and be killed, and after 3 days rise again." He spoke this word openly. Then Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him. But when he had turned around and looked at his disciples, he rebuked Peter, saying, "Get behind me, Satan, for you are not mindful of the things of God, but of the things of men." Okay, so before we dive into that, I want to talk about the humility of Peter, okay? Because it's kind of, it's not spelled out in the scripture, I don't think, and that's why I wanted you to understand Matthew's relation to Peter and Mark's relation to Peter, because I think we can very much see in the Gospels, when you look at these peripheral details, the humility of Peter. The first thing is that Mark's account that we just read goes straight from a proclamation to a chastisement, right? Mark didn't, split any hairs over it. He went straight from Peter saying, and we'll talk about that, from saying that Christ was the Messiah, and that then right into "Get behind me, Satan" to Peter, right? Matthew writes extensively about Peter being the rock, okay, and not Mark. So again, Peter, in my mind, is like, didn't want Mark, he didn't want his name elevated, so to speak, in his telling of the gospel story of who Jesus was to Mark. not telling Mark this aspect of this exchange about who Peter was, what Christ said Peter was, that we spent in the first week when Peter the man, we talked about Peter the rock, then he became a disciple, and then Christ reaffirmed him in Matthew about being the rock. Okay, the other thing is Matthew's account of Jesus walking on the water includes Peter trying the same. Some would say that Peter probably didn't want Mark to put it in his gospel because he was embarrassed because he failed. But I like to think that he didn't want it in Mark's gospel because, again, keep his name out of the way so that Christ could be glorified and talk about what Christ did. And Matthew, being who he was, did include it in his gospel because Peter walking on the water is only in Matthew's gospel. Luke includes the proclamation but not the chastisement. Okay, I think that again points to Peter's humility, that he was very straightforward telling Mark what occurred and what happened, and Luke was just like, yeah, Peter was the guy. He was the first to proclaim that Christ was the Son of God, and he didn't include the part where he chastised Peter. Okay, so let's go ahead and jump into the passage. We're going to jump into verse 29. It says, "He said to them, 'Who do you say that I am?' Peter answered and said, 'You are the Christ.'" Okay, we know this. We talked about this a few weeks ago, but we looked at it from Matthew's viewpoint. But here in Mark, the next verse we go into, Peter answered, "You are the Christ," but the next verse, that there's nothing about him being the rock. He jumps right into Christ saying, then he strictly warned them that they should tell no one about him. Okay, this strictly warned them. As you read through the Gospels, you can see Christ continually telling the people he healed, telling the disciples, don't share this information. And so now we need to back up and be like, okay, what was Mark's focus in the Gospel? Mark's focus in his Gospel was Christ, the suffering servant. What were the people looking for in the Messiah? What did they want? They wanted him to be this great king. He wanted to be a conquering hero to come and kick Rome out of the country. And so this plays into this mindset of who Christ is. He strictly warned them not to tell anyone, plays into the passage that we read in Mark on why Christ responded to Peter the way he did. Okay, I like to use as an example this idea of you don't necessarily share, not the gospel good news, but news that's about to happen. When Josie and I were getting ready to go into Village Missions, I was trying to time the moment that we were going to be assigned to our first church with my resignation of my job that I was working because we needed every penny we could get. Okay? But what was interesting, what happened, it ended up being an opportunity to be a great witness for what I was doing and where I was going, because what happened was that two of my co-workers knew that I was going into Village Missions. Okay? They actually helped support us a little bit at first. But so they knew that the time was coming, but we were keeping it kind of not telling the boss because I wanted to keep my job. And so, but then one of the gentlemen found out, because he was close to the boss, that there was going to be layoffs coming. Okay? And so he reached out to me and he said, I don't know where you're at, but they're getting ready to lay off some people in our department. I don't know if you're at a point where you can tell them. And we weren't quite yet. Okay, so I went to my boss, immediately called him up, prayed about it. I didn't even really have to pray about it, but you just get that nudge that, yeah, I need to say something. So I called my boss, and I told him, because we were all working from home at that point, called my boss and told him what the deal was. And he goes, I didn't even get to talk to him very much about it. He said, I need to go. I need to hang up and I need to go. He says, I'm about ready. I just told them to lay off these two people, and now we don't need to lay them off. And so because of where I was, the position I was in, they were able to save two jobs so that whole strictly warning those two friends, don't tell the boss I'm quitting soon because we need to time it right, turned in an opportunity to see that I was willing to sacrifice the salary that I was getting so that somebody else could keep their job. And that's not to pat myself on the back. It's just to show that God orchestrated the timing so that it ended up being a good witness that this guy is going into the mission field, and he made sure that two people would not lose their jobs. Okay, so this is kind of the idea I want to show in what Christ is saying, because before we get into, well, let's go ahead and read the next verse, and I'll continue. So keep that story in mind. It says, "And he began to teach them that the Son of Man must suffer many things, be rejected by the elders and chief priests and scribes." Okay, so he began to teach that he must suffer many things. Okay, so he strictly told them warned them not to tell anyone. Again, and so you've got to put these pieces together. I hope I'm stacking up well enough for you to follow. Is that they wanted the conquering hero. And Jesus was not there to be the conquering hero. He was there to be the suffering servant. And if you really get into looking in the Old Testament and why the Jews had such a hard time and they didn't accept Jesus who he was, is because they did not see in the Old Testament prophecies the suffering servant aspect of who Jesus was. They saw the conquering hero that he was supposed to be, and he will be in the future. And so Christ is strictly telling them, don't tell anybody, because what would happen? I mean, think what Jesus did, right? He's healing people. He fed 5,000. He walks on the water. He calms the storm. This is the guy. The disciples are thinking, Peter's thinking, this is the guy. He's here. We've been waiting. He's here. This is the guy. And yet Jesus is telling them, because Jesus would be able to prevent them putting him in power and trying that, but we're seeing that dynamic here in the Word of why that is, okay? Because that's not what he was here for, okay? So here we see not telling people something, even though it's great of who he is, because he didn't want a mass of people trying to make him king, trying to put him in charge, trying to elevate him. And that aspect of it is also going to play into this passage as we go through it. And of course, we see that he was rejected by the elders, the chief priests, and the scribes. We see that all through. This is still fairly early in Mark's gospel. We're about halfway through it. But already all the religious people of the Jews was like, this ain't the Christ, don't be telling us this is the Christ. And so he was being rejected by all the leaders, but these disciples and the people we're talking, remember I said about the multitude, the 5,000 that he fed just recently, he fed 5,000, that was just the men, and the women and children are saying it was about 15 or 20,000 that he fed. So he's got probably a lot of fans, right? He's got a lot of people that are like, oh, wow, this could be the guy, okay? But yet the religious leaders are rejecting him. And here's the kicker. This is one of the first times he's telling the disciples, and be killed, and after 3 days rise again. It's kind of a little humorous because we get to see the end result. It's a little humorous to think Christ told them 3 times at least that he was going to be crucified and rise again. And where were they when he was dead in the tomb for 3 days? They were mourning and moaning and groaning in the room, and then didn't believe the women that come and told them that his body's gone, right? So even though they were told, they couldn't remember that aspect. Okay, so he spoke this word openly. Then Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him. Okay, so Peter's like, this is the guy. I know this is the guy because of all this stuff he's doing. It's who we've been waiting for. And now he's openly telling the disciples around him, don't be telling people this stuff. Okay? So Peter's like taking him aside to begin to rebuke him. Okay? Peter's kind of acting like this. Anybody remember this character? Right? He's like, I didn't want to put Jesus on this meme. I just didn't feel right about adding Jesus. But Peter's kind of like saying, what are you talking about, Jesus? Let's have a sidebar here because you don't realize who you are, okay? And so, but when he had turned around and looked at his disciples, so right away we see that Jesus is about to do something openly, right? That Peter doesn't want him to, we'll find out, doesn't want to do. This reminds me of a story when I was a kid. My dad and brother loved to fish, and I kind of tagged along at the time. And we were launching the boat. I remember, I can even picture it still to this day in my brain. It was a misty morning. The mist was around, kind of not really foggy, but not great visibility. And so colors were really stark and stood out. And as my dad was launching the boat, I saw something green by the boat, and it was a $20 bill. So I kind of pick up the $20 bill, and I'm trying to pull my dad aside. He's trying to launch the boat, right? He doesn't realize that I just picked up a $20 bill, and I kind of sneak up to my dad, and I'm like, Dad, I just found $20. And I'm thinking, no, it's like this deep secret. We better, it's $20. And my dad's like, openly, oh, so you're going to buy us lunch? And it's that thing. But when he turned around and looked at his disciples, I kind of could see that Peter knew he was in for something, and I don't know that he was ready for this. He says he rebuked Peter, saying, "Get behind me, Satan." Why is that? Why was Jesus so harsh on Peter? What was one of the temptations that Christ went through when he went into the desert to be tempted? The devil took him up and said, if you serve me, bow down and serve me, I will give you rule over the kingdoms of the earth, because he was the prince of power of the air and he could do that. And so Peter was doing the exact same thing, because he is so focused on the conquering hero that, like, Jesus, what are you talking about? We can do this. We can take him. We can take him. We can do this. And Jesus is saying, get behind me, Satan. Just squashed it, because that was the same temptation that he'd already faced from the devil. And he wanted people to openly know, this is not what I'm here for. Okay? Because what? What's going on? And why can I say that he was more about getting Jesus to be the new hero? Is because he says to him, you are not mindful of the things of God, but the things of men. You're too worldly focused. You're too much thinking about the here and now, and you're not seeing the bigger picture. You're not seeing what God wants. You're not seeing the whole image of why I'm here. You're not seeing that I'm not here to take over yet. Okay? And so that's why he really squashed Peter. And so that's the thing I pointed out. Went straight to, you are the Christ, to get behind me, Satan. Right? 6 verses, we see that transition, that Peter's saying something great and recognizing who he is, and then he's getting squished like a bug, right, Josie? Our youngest used to say that when he was little, squished like a bug. Okay, it's because he's, it's sandwiched in that short amount of time. We're seeing Peter on his top end of the game and Peter on the bottom end of his game. Okay? So let's look to see what Mark left out of his gospel. So we're going to go back to Matthew chapter 16. I've read part of these verses already before, and I told you we'd dive into them a little bit more, and here we are diving into them. It's Matthew chapter 16, and we're in verse 17. It said, Jesus answered and said to him, Blessed are you, Simon Bar-Jonah, for flesh and blood has not revealed this to you, but my Father who is in heaven. Remember the prior verse. Simon Peter answered, you said, you are the Christ, the Son of the living God. Even more than what Mark recorded in his gospel, he records in Mark's gospel, you are the Christ. Here Matthew's saying he's also recognizing he's the Son of the living God. Okay, so flesh and blood has not revealed this to you, but my Father who is in heaven. And he continues. This is the same episode, right? The same thing that Mark left out, but Matthew's including in this exchange that they have. He says, I also say to you that you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of Hades shall not prevail against it. And I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven, and whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven. Okay? So let's talk about rocks and keys. All right? We see first, jumping straight to verse 18, it says, And I also say to you that you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of Hades shall not prevail against it. So let's talk about Peter. Petrus, we've already gone over that, means the rock. And then we're talking about on this rock. So there's 4 views on what this dialogue really means, okay? And I'm going to give my little 2 cents worth in it, all right? First off, we need to recognize that Peter, I call you Peter, is a masculine noun, and it means a piece of a rock, okay? And then rock, this rock, is a feminine noun, and it means a mass of rock. So Peter's like the little rock, and you got the big rock, and that's where the part of the confusion starts on what Christ is saying, the play on words. Okay, so the four views of this rock is that the rock is Peter, okay, because, Christ is going to build his church, and the backing for this idea is that Acts chapter 2 and Acts chapter 10, I think it's chapter 10, is when the church kind of got started after Peter, on the day of Pentecost, 3,000 souls were saved, and later in chapter 10, I believe it is, he went to Cornelius's house, and that's the first time the Gentiles were accepted into the faith. So that's kind of where they get the support for this idea that Peter is the rock, and on this rock I will build my church. The second option is the rock is the truth in Peter's statement. You are the Christ, the Son of the living God. So that's where they're saying that's what the rock is. This rock is him saying, you are the Christ, the Son of the living God. The other option is that the rock is Peter's faith, the very fact that he believed that Christ is the Son of God. Christ, he is the Messiah. He is the Christ. So the rock is the strength of Peter's faith because he is so on board and so ready to say, you are the Christ, the Son of the living God. The fourth one is that the rock is Jesus. Okay, and so on this rock is Christ, the support for that. Christ is the chief cornerstone, right? The church, he's the chief cornerstone. He brought the Jews and the Gentiles together as part of that chief cornerstone. We talked about that in Ephesians. And the church was built upon the foundation of Christ. So I'm going to give you my 2 cents worth. I don't think number 1 and 4 are quite accurate. The intent behind them is good, but I don't think it's really what Christ is saying. The rock is not, because we see it's a feminine noun that is being used for this rock. Okay, and just know, this is not like, I guess I would say salvational. If you disagree with me, okay. But I like to point out what I feel the truth behind this is that I think 2 and 3 best fit the idea. The rock is the truth in Peter's statement. Yes, Christ, he is the Christ. He is the Son of God. That is true. That is accurate. That's a real thing. The rock is Peter's faith. Peter was solid in what he was saying. But because he was solid in what he was saying, and because of the truth in his statement, he still was kind of the one that we already talked about. He was the first one to preach to the 3,000 that got saved, and he was the first one to bring the Gentiles into the fold, so to speak. Remember, the whole dynamic that happened with that is that Cornelius, a Gentile, had a dream about, because he was wanting to serve God, Peter had a dream, and the sheep with the unclean animals comes down out of heaven, and God's telling Peter, take and eat. And Peter was saying, no, I don't touch that stuff. That happened 3 times, and then Cornelius' servants come knocking on the door, and Peter goes with them to his. You got to realize why that's such a big deal, and why they want to use this as a reason to say that Peter is the rock, is because Gentiles were not supposed to go into the homes of Gentiles. They were Gentile dogs. They were not the chosen. They were not God's people. So, no, we stay away from them. In fact, that's part of why Paul got in trouble when he went back to Jerusalem and they arrested him and the whole riot started, is because they tried to say that he was hanging out with the Gentile and went into the temple without properly cleaning himself. Okay, so there's this whole dynamic of Gentiles were not looked favorably upon by the Jews. And so that's why they want to say, but there's still, the fact is, the rock is the truth in Peter's statement and in his faith, and Jesus is saying that on this rock I will build my church. On this fact of truth, this whole foundation of why I came to this earth, and why I died on the cross, and why I'm saving you from your sins, is so that I have a bridegroom that I can present to my Father, right? And so that is the rock of Peter of this statement. That is what the church is about. Okay? So continuing on from there, then let's talk about the keys. And I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven, and whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven. I know there's a lot of different ideas about what that really means, and I'll try to shed some light on it. First, the keys to the kingdom of heaven. Okay? Again, this ties back to what Peter did as starting the church, but it also applies to all the apostles as they preached the gospel in the book of Acts, and the church took off, okay? So the keys is just, when you say the keys, like if you get keys to the city or whatever, it just means it gives you that's probably not even a good example because you don't really get anything when you get the keys to a city. But the keys to the kingdom of heaven is the means to getting into heaven. The method by which you get into heaven. And what is that method by which you get into heaven is the gospel, right? And so Jesus had the disciples. They learned who he was. They learned what the gospel was. And they had those keys to give to other people to help them get into heaven, to give them that news, okay? And what is it saying? Whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven. This is a Jewish concept that loose and bind is basically a forbidding and a permitting. Whatever you forbid on earth will be forbidden in heaven. Whatever you forbid or permit in heaven will be permitted on earth. That's the thing. But where it gets twisted up on the way it's said, and the translation from the Greek, is it's a hard translation because you're like, Peter has power over heaven to do this? And that's not quite the way it means. It means more that whatever you bind on earth is already bound on heaven. He's not making any rules to get any new rules or any new means and not being able to kick people out or kick people in. It's just that it's already decided in heaven. And so whatever he binds on earth, whatever he forbids on earth, as far as the faith, believing in Christ, who Christ is, that's already been decided in heaven, okay? And whatever is not permitted or whatever is permitted in your faith, that has already been decided in heaven, okay? So that leads me to my so what. And that's where this so what comes from, if you've already read it in your bulletin. We should remember the hard lessons Christ has taken us through and need to remember the good he has taken us into. Combined, they make us who we are. So Peter could have left out the part where he got chastised by Christ. He could have left that out of his talking to Mark. Mark could have left it out. But the thing is, we should remember those hard lessons we learned. Okay, we shouldn't forget the things we went through that were bad and hard and that we feel like we blew it. Okay, but we definitely need to remember the good he has brought us into. And that is much more important. We shouldn't live in the past, but what we could get from the past is what he has brought us into. It makes us who we are. The hard things we have faced that we may have failed on, and the hard things we faced that he helped us get us through, those make us who we are, but it's not who we are. There's actually a song that talks about a past, and I don't quite agree with it because I shouldn't have gone here because I can't remember the song. There's a song that basically is playing the game that you shouldn't remember your past. And I don't agree with that. We don't hold ourselves in guilt. We don't hold ourselves down. In fact, I'll go ahead and go to the point to ponder. It says, do you live in the good Christ has done in you, or are you dragged down by the bad that has been forgiven? Right? So we need to remember those things, but they're not intended to bring us down. They're intended to encourage us on what Christ has taken us through and what Christ has done for us, right? And what we're into. So yeah, we shouldn't live in that, but we should always remember, we were talking in Sunday school about being thankful for what God has done. If you put aside the past and think, I don't want to live in that past completely, and you ignore it, how are you going to be so thankful for what God did if you refuse to acknowledge the things that you wish you hadn't done in the past? So don't live in guilt, but recognize what God has brought you out of. And then for next week, finalize memorizing first, that shouldn't be finalized. This is a new set of scriptures. So start memorizing 1 Peter 2, 1 through 3, and read Acts chapter 2. I figure we're talking all about this on Peter, and we might, that's what's hard about what am I going to cover and what I'm not, because there's a lot of good things in the sermon that Peter teaches, but is that really helping us get to know Peter? So I struggle with what do we want to cover and what do we want to cover, because I do eventually want to get to 1 Peter. Okay, so but read Acts chapter 2. It's an amazing passage. It's the sermon Peter preaches, and how that chapter ends is great. So go ahead and read that.